I'm Aiden. Thank you so much for coming. I work on developer tools. I love APIs. I'm a runner and I'm a stand-up comic. So I'm really happy the mic is loose and I can walk with it and do the whole. It's very important. I also created the Optic open source project, and as part of that, over the last 2 years, I have helped a ton of companies, some big, some small, some as large as Sneak and Southwest, start working API first. And I've learned a lot through that process that I want to share today to help everyone understand a little bit about some of the real-world challenges you'll face if you start working API first too. So talk's called Governing APIs After They Ship. I think in an ideal world, I mean, this is probably how everyone's company is. You design the perfect API the first time, you build it, and there's no problems at all. Every customer loves it on site, and then ... heat death of the universe. This is typical, right? Yep. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm seeing some smile. Oh, that's your, wow, cool. This is how some people actually live. For everyone else, it looks a little more like this. There's some APIs over here that we're deprecating. Some of them are 3 years, 5 years, 10 years old. There's new stuff we're building. Something over there is on fire. We have breaking changes. Our customers tell us that they love it, but they also want us to change everything. So a little bit of mixed messaging there. We have breaking changes, and there's an API we didn't even know about. That's so cool. And this is the starting point that most people are at when they want to start working API first and adopt API governance, and you can imagine why. Like if you're thinking about API governance, it's because somehow we ended up here and not on the happy path. So this is normal. This is where everyone is, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the stuff we've done to help people make the jump to working a little more API first. So it's hard to put the best practices into practice, but I think we should really pause for a moment and think about what we're trying to achieve before I start throwing solutions at you. So I like to think about API development as satellites. I think it's actually a really good metaphor because once you launch a satellite, it's really expensive to change it. Like it's in space now, it's hundreds of miles away, and you can't reach it. So big changes require new launches. When we want to launch a new, kind of telescope or a new sensor, we have to put a whole new satellite up in orbit. And it's the same thing for APIs. We can't just like make big changes to things that our customers are using. You might be able to make really small changes like software updates on the satellite if you've made it evolvable, but that's not common. And consumers expect it to be working all the time in a specific place doing a specific job. So I've shared this with a lot of developers, and it really clicks because all of a sudden it's like, ooh, cool, space. But also it is a really good metaphor for what makes API development so different. So this is the Hubble Space Telescope. It is the only time we've launched, I had to look this up this morning, 12,000 satellites. This is the only time we've ever fixed one. So it's probably true for your API programs as well. And finally, I think your API, you shouldn't think of it as code. And this is really helpful to tell developers on API teams because it's not your code. Your API is all the promises that you've made to your consumers. And your code might change, you might rewrite it, but if you keep those promises, you've done a good job. So what we're really governing, I think, what the whole goal of governance is to create an organization where the promises we make to each other are kept and everybody trusts them. That allows you to move fast, to ship great software and all work together a whole lot better if you're not wondering if like the rug's gonna be pulled out from under you every single day that you're working. So I know a lot of governance focuses on design reviews, style guides, figuring out how to make APIs consistent. But all of that is easiest to do and also most important before you ship. After you ship, the number one thing people want is to make sure there's no breaking changes, to make sure they're being thoughtful about the things that they do change, because you don't want your API to have really good design because the design board was involved early on, but then it just sort of slowly degrades as people change it over time. You want to make sure that you're following your style guide, and you want to make sure if it was secure on day 1, and hopefully it was, it's still secure on day 500, day 1,000, day 5,000. So that's what I think becomes really important once you ship. And it's also concerns most people are going to have on day 1 since their APIs already exist, and we're not living in the imaginary world we talked about in the beginning. So If APIs are promises, then the first thing you need to do is track your promises. So whether you're doing an event-driven API and use async API, or you're doing a REST API, Open API, GraphQL is a little easier on this. But it's really important to track every promise you've made, because you're not going to be able to keep your promises if you don't even know what they are. And this is where a lot of people are today. So just by a show of hands, who has every API in their company documented? Okay, that's less than a tenth of the room. Keep your hands up if you're confident that the documentation is accurate. Hero. Oh. All right, that's less than 1%. So I'm imagining most people are somewhere in the middle. Some of the APIs are documented. You might not be sure if they're documented correctly. What that actually means isn't that you don't have documentation. It's that you don't know the promises you've made to your consumers. And that makes it really hard to keep the promises. So there's a lot of ways to get caught up. This was a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 2 years. And they broadly kind of fall into 3 categories. You can generate OpenAPI, sort of your list of promises from your code. You can generate that OpenAPI, sort of get caught up by looking at traffic and then modeling the API's behavior. That's what Optic and some other tools do. And you can also write the OpenAPI manually. They all have different trade-offs. So sorry, the colors didn't come through too well. But if you're generating OpenAPI from code, you're going to spend a lot of upfront effort, like doing tooling and rewriting and getting these frameworks set up. But then there's very low effort going forward. So if you can afford to do that, it might make sense. If you're generating OpenAPI from your traffic, there's like medium effort up front, and then moderate effort going forward to maintain it. And these slides will be available with better contrast. And then if you're writing OpenAPI manually, obviously that's a lot of effort up front, and it's a lot of effort on an ongoing basis just to track all your promises. So I think the more automation you can do here is really important, and especially if you're kind of behind on documentation, just getting caught up is really important to being able to keep any of these promises to users. So one of the things that Optic does, the open source project that I've been working on, is you can actually show it real traffic from Postman or from HAR logs that you collect, and it'll show you basically a comparison between your current OpenAPI spec, which might be completely empty if you just started, and the traffic that you have, and it'll show you all the things that it recognizes, so all the things that are documented but not documented correctly, and give you simple one-line commands to update it. It'll go patch the spec for you and say, hey, this is wrong, let me add this field or change the type here, and it'll help you actually collaboratively build that OpenAPI. It'll show you things that are undocumented and give you another simple command to go add those things to your spec. So we've helped a lot of teams get caught up with their first specs really quickly, and that's helped them sort of know the promises they've made and then start keeping them. So another thing that's really important that we've seen with developers on teams that adopted OpenAPI is OpenAPI diffs aren't very readable. Like if you look at this change in Slack's API, you can't tell me which endpoint this has been a change to. You can't really tell me if these changes are breaking, which users they affect, any of that kind of information. The Git diffs are a really bad way to think about API changes. So we're not the only ones who have built this, but there are a lot of companies that different startups who are working on products that add real visual API changelogs to all of your commits. So here's what Optics looks like. It comments on every PR that changes the OpenAPI file. And then it gives you a semantic changelog where instead of being grouped by files and lines, it's grouped by the operations in the OpenAPI and exactly what's changed. So it's really easy to read. If there's any kind of breaking changes, we highlight those and other kinds of governance rules and issues so developers know exactly what's been changed and can actually do effective API reviews. I thought this was just like a cool feature, but it's actually one of the things that have helped teams make much better decisions because they didn't realize they weren't actually doing review. They were just glancing, hitting approve, and this actually made them think about what was changing. So sometimes it's the small things that make the most difference. Cool. So that was a lot of hand waving. I'll help all of you / the internet will get your APIs documented so everyone raises their hand next year. But once you know what promises you've made, how do you keep them? This is where kind of understanding what the challenges are for developers. So developers don't want to break consumers. Like, nobody wakes up in the morning being like, haha, I'm going to break a consumer. Everyone wants to do a good job. The challenge is knowing what is a breaking change and what isn't is very opaque. And in some businesses, the definition is different. So just a fun story. I was working with a sports league, and they upgraded cameras that had more precision. So like, they made their cameras better. And that ended up being a breaking change for their business in their API, because people were using the digits and the precisions that were coming out of that API to do calculations that affected their business. So like, sometimes even changing the precision of a measurement can be a breaking change. So every business has slightly different definitions of this stuff. And really the best thing you can do is make it just really hard to break stuff. So we have CI tools. There's also other ones like OAS diff and OpenAPI diff that can run in CI and basically block pull requests that break the API contract. And that's been really effective, reducing breaking changes everywhere. Sometimes developers have to figure out other ways of building stuff, but it's much better to do that than break a user and now have to live with that. We've even heard from some teams that they made a breaking change, and then they reverted the breaking change. And in the 2 days it took them to do that, someone started using the broken version of it, and then it was a breaking change for that person when they put it back. Yeah, this happens. Cool. The last thing I want to talk about, and I don't know where everyone is in their journey around defining their team's API standards. It's definitely something that's important the bigger you get, but it's very difficult once you have API standards to keep following them as you go. And the challenge that most teams run into is that they learn things, which, you know, on the surface sounds good, but that means that their API standards change. And you can actually make breaking changes to your standards in ways that you could add a rule. For instance, let's say we realized that all of the naming in our API was bad. We were using snake case somewhere, camel case other places, and we think, we're going to make everyone's day better. We're going to add a rule that says every name from now on has to be camel case. Well, it doesn't quite work the way you expect, because you're going to start failing everything that already exists. You know, that's supposed to be a red X. The contrast is bad. Sorry about that. So cool. We've done this. This name current status isn't allowed, but you know, it hasn't made a breaking change, so we're fine. So let's say we see this X, and a developer thinks, okay, I'm going to go change current status to be camel case, and that way my rule will pass, and I'll be able to finish my build and get stuff out. Well, now you're in this catch-22 because you've made one rule pass, but now your rule that says no breaking changes is failing, and you're stuck in this endless loop that you can't get out of. And that's part of the reason why we built a tool at Optic that can work with. This got closed when I restarted my computer, so give me one sec. So we built a tool at Optic that basically lets you run spectral rules and other kind of linting rules differently depending on whether something was added to the API or whether it was there the whole time. So this is the same naming rule in that example. Console be fast. Demos. Cool. There we go. Damn it. Okay, that's going to be annoying. Laid plans. Cool. So this is that example I just showed you. It's failing current status because it's not camel case. And if a developer goes and changes it, it'll yell at them for making a breaking change. But if you're running your spectral rules through Optic, you can set up this requirement that the rule only runs when things are added to the API. And if you do this, what's really cool is it won't even count this as a rule it needs to run, because that was already in the API. We know we can't change it, so why are our linting rules running on stuff that you couldn't change anyway? So that makes it really easy to write advanced rules. Some of the companies that use Optic, like Sneak, have hundreds of rules that they run this way, and it actually has allowed them to change their API standards as they learn things, change how pagination works, and a lot of other really big things without having to worry about getting all these nasty Slack messages saying, hey, my pipeline's broken, or why isn't this working anymore? So I think this is really important, just to understand, the best thing that can happen to you is that you learn, and you don't want to sort of punish developers for learning new things. So I like to think of this as sort of going beyond linting. We want to make sure that there's no breaking changes. We want to make sure that, whatever our versioning strategy is followed. So some of the people who have written rules using these added and changed kinds of rules, have set it up so, you know, if they do date-based versioning, everyone has to follow that. It makes it really easy to do sort of these policies that are hard to explain to people, but if you're nudged by the tool, it can be a lot easier to get it done. And then I just showed you that demo where, you know, we only check the additions. We don't check the, you know, the stuff that's been there already that we couldn't really change because of that little, you know, breaking change catch-22. Cool. So the summary is all the fun is after you ship. Keeping track of your promises, adopting OpenAPI, which seems like, you know, one of the challenges that the room's having more than any other stuff, is a really important first step. The good news is in the last year or two, there's been a lot of work in the open source world to build better tools that make it easier for all of us to adopt OpenAPI. And I would say, you know, if you're advocating for this internally with your stakeholders, don't say we need to adopt OpenAPI. Say we need to keep our promises to consumers or build a culture of API trust or these kinds of things that I think mean a lot more than the standard. Once you've, you know, tracked your promises, which I know, again, it's a lift, but it's easier now than ever before, it's really important to set up the tooling so it's easy to keep the promises. It's not obvious to developers what a breaking change is. I still get confused by it sometimes. It's like context matters so much. So make it easy with tools. And if you do that, you'll be able to, you know, put everything you learn, both from feedback about your API, new API standards, and all the other things you learn as you build your API governance programs into practice right away. And I think that's how you build a program that is moving really quickly, when you make it easy to take your learnings and put them into practice immediately after. Cool. Thank you so much. Feel free to come ask some questions. I'm on Twitter, project's on GitHub, and there's my email if anyone wants to get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen. And we have time for questions. No questions? Oh, like say.
Thank you. As you mentioned, there are different ways how to define a breaking change. Is it possible with Optic also to customize what's a breaking change or not?
Yeah, so we have a lot of users who have sort of added their extra details. So we have a rules SDK. You can basically hook on to any part of the spec and say, this is a rule all the time. This is a rule when things are added. This is a rule when things are removed. Or this is a rule when things are changed. And that gives you a lot of ability to set up things like rules for formats, you know, rules for enum case changes, those kinds of more detailed stuff that might be more specific to your company. So that's all on the GitHub and on our website, useoptic.com. There's docs that show you how to do that, and I'm happy to help anyone here write rules if they're interested.
Another question? Yes.
Maybe you mentioned it and I missed it, but are there some of, like, let's say libraries like these that integrate with ESLint or linting rules where you can inside your IDE see some of those stuff?
So I think a lot of API linting tools have some like CLI output like we do. It's been an ask to add IDE plugins for that that make it show up right along ESLint or in its own sort of IDE plugin. We haven't built those yet, but it's definitely something that we've been asked about a lot, and I mean I would use it every day if it existed. Cool, thank you.
Other questions? What do you think? I have one. So this is actually running on the premises, the contract. Do you have plan to also run on the actual traffic? Because breaking change can take many forms. And for instance, having a request which takes a longer or a shorter time than usual may introduce a breaking change in some consumer. So have you planned around that?
Yeah, so there's definitely some breaking changes that pretty much only exist in like production and at runtime. So the timing is one. Sometimes like the number of items in an array can break, you know, some of the transport layers or some of the app expectations. So we don't have anything at runtime now, but I think it's kind of a natural place you have to go, and it might be somewhere that we invest more in over the next year or two. Or partner with people who have traffic streams like the lovely David. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I'm standing between you and your snack time, so go get snacks. And I'll be up here if anyone wants to talk more about getting their APIs documented, or I'll be online. So thank you so much.
Thank you.